April 13th, 1945, 0300 hours, Kakazu Ridge, Okinawa. The sound you're hearing, that metallic ring echoing through the darkness. That's not artillery. That's something the field manuals never mentioned. That's the sound of a mortar round being smashed against volcanic rock. Armed by hand, thrown like a grenade by a man who had no other choice. 25 enemy dead by sunrise. 1 American soldier standing. 75 attackers driven back. The mathematics don't work. Except they did. Because Technical Sergeant Buford Theodore Anderson understood something the Imperial Japanese Army didn't expect. He understood that physics doesn't care about doctrine, that a fuse mechanism is just metal and springs, and that desperation combined with technical knowledge can rewrite the rules of engagement in under 30 seconds. Here's what the official reports tried to bury, what Hollywood copied in Saving Private Ryan without crediting the source, what military academies from West Point to Moscow now teach as improvised tactics under extreme duress. The technique of percussive arming, the act of hand-bombing mortar rounds by simulating setback force, a method so dangerous that even mentioning it violated safety protocols, yet so effective that it saved an entire defensive sector from collapse. The Army classified the after-action report, not because it failed, but because it worked too well, because if word spread that a single soldier with a crate of 60mm rounds could hold off a reinforced platoon, every supply officer in the Pacific would have to recalculate ammunition distribution. Every infantry manual would need revision. Every tactical doctrine would face questions it couldn't answer. But we're getting ahead, because to understand how one man held Kakazu Ridge that night, you need to understand where he came from. You need to see the farm in Eagle, Wisconsin. You need to feel the weight of the Great Depression on a 6-year-old boy whose mother just died. You need to follow him through 2 years of training that transformed a rural kid into a mortar specialist, through the mud of Leyte where he earned his first Bronze Star dragging wounded men 50 yards under fire, through the landing at Okinawa where the beaches were empty because the real killing ground waited inland. 4 months until the war ends. Everything is at stake. The Japanese 32nd Army has dug into the Shuri line. General Ushijima knows he's lost, but he's buying time with blood. And on this particular morning, Technical Sergeant Anderson commands 8 men operating 360mm mortars in a gap between Kakazu Ridge and Kakazu West. A saddle in the terrain that looks insignificant on maps but represents the hinge point of the entire western flank. When those 75 Imperial soldiers come through the darkness, when the bombardment hits and every man in that mortar crew goes down wounded, when Anderson orders his bleeding team to fall back to an Okinawan tomb for cover, when he turns to face the attack alone with just an M1 carbine and 30 rounds per magazine, that's when the real story begins. That's when improvisation becomes survival. That's when one man's understanding of mechanical physics becomes the difference between holding the line and losing the entire sector. July 6th, 1922, Eagle, Wisconsin. Buford Theodore Anderson enters the world in a farming community where hard work isn't a virtue. It's a requirement for survival. His father, William Herbert, works the land. His mother, Ruth Rebecca Calloway, manages a household that barely scrapes by. And when the stock market crashes 7 years later, when his mother dies in 1929, leaving a 6-year-old boy without maternal guidance, during the worst economic collapse in American history, that's when Anderson learns the first lesson that will save his life 16 years later. He learns that hope is optional, but competence is mandatory. No silver spoons here, no prep school education, no family connections to smooth the path. Just a kid in Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, doing farm labor and manual work, because that's what everyone did. Because the Depression didn't care about dreams or potential, it cared about whether you could work hard enough to eat. By October 8th, 1942, when Anderson walks into the Army recruiting station at age 20, he's not running toward glory. He's accepting reality. Pearl Harbor happened. The Pacific is burning. And men from small towns in Wisconsin don't get exemptions. They get orders. He joins the 96th Infantry Division, a unit so new the paint on their equipment hasn't dried, filled with draftees and volunteers who've never heard a shot fired in anger. 2 years of training follow: Camp Adair in Oregon, where they learn to march and shoot; Camp Beale in California, where they practice amphibious assault; Hawaii, where the training gets realistic, where live ammunition replaces blanks and mistakes get measured in casualties, not reprimands. By July 1944, when the 96 ships out to the Southwest Pacific, Anderson has transformed from farm kid to trained specialist. He knows mortars, understands the mathematics of indirect fire, can calculate deflection and elevation faster than most men can read a compass. Leyte, Philippines, October 20th, 1944. The 96th hits the beach, and within hours, Anderson faces his first real combat. But unlike most soldiers freezing in their first firefight, he moves. He sees 2 wounded Americans pinned down 50 yards away in a kill zone. He crosses that distance under sustained enemy fire, administers first aid while rounds snap past his head, holds pressure on wounds until the stretcher bearers arrive. The Bronze Star citation uses words like conspicuous gallantry and disregard for personal safety. But Anderson never talks about it that way. He just says he saw men who needed help and he helped them. That's the critical point about Anderson. He's not hunting medals. He's not trying to be a hero. He's a mortar specialist doing his job. And when circumstances demand action, he acts because that's what competent soldiers do. Not because he wants recognition, but because the alternative is watching good men die. But here's the tactical irony that sets up Kakazu Ridge. Anderson's specialty is the 60mm mortar, a weapon designed for long-range indirect fire. You set up 300 meters behind the front line. You calculate angles and charges. You drop rounds on targets you never see. That's the entire doctrine of mortar warfare. Separation from the enemy. Distance equals safety. Your job is support, not direct combat. So when Anderson and his 8-man crew deploy to Kakazu Ridge in early April 1945, when they dig in at that saddle position between the ridges, they expect to be doing standard mortar work, receiving fire missions from forward observers, calculating trajectories, sending high-angle fire onto Japanese positions hundreds of meters away. That's the plan. That's what mortar crews do. Except Kakazu Ridge isn't cooperating with doctrine. The ridge is only 280 feet high, but it's fortified like a medieval castle. The Japanese have tunneled into the reverse slopes, built bunkers that survive artillery bombardment, positioned machine guns with interlocking fields of fire that turn every American advance into a meat grinder. On April 9th, Colonel Edwin May launches a frontal assault expecting surprise. Instead, the 383rd Infantry Regiment walks into devastation. Over 300 casualties in hours. The attack collapses. Survivors crawl back under fire. April 10th and 11th bring more assaults, more artillery preparation, more American bodies piling up at the base of Kakazu. The 96th Division is exhausted. 3 days of failed attacks have shattered, and Anderson's crew sits in their position, watching the carnage, firing support missions when called, but knowing that their mortars aren't changing the equation. The Japanese are too deep, too well protected, too determined. Then General Cho convinces Ushijima to authorize the counteroffensive. The Japanese plan is simple. 6 battalions, over 3,000 men, infiltrate through American lines in the pre-dawn darkness of April 13th, hit defensive positions from flanks and rear, create chaos, and possibly trigger a collapse. It's aggressive, it's risky, and Lieutenant Colonel Yahara warns it will result in catastrophic casualties, but Cho prevails and the order goes out. Anderson doesn't know any of this strategic planning. He doesn't know that 75 Imperial soldiers are moving through the darkness toward his exact position. He doesn't know he's about to become the hinge point of the entire counteroffensive. All he knows is it's April 13th, 0300 hours, cold and damp. His men are tired, and the night is about to explode. The first sound is wrong. It's not rifle fire or machine guns. It's the deep crump of mortar rounds impacting, Japanese 60mm and Type 89 knee mortars. The shells come in fast and close, no warning, just sudden detonations that turn Anderson's position into a fragment storm, and within seconds, every man in his crew is hit. Shrapnel doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about training or courage. It just tears through flesh and bone. Anderson feels the impacts. Hot metal slicing into his side, his arms, his legs. He's bleeding but still functional. He looks around and sees his 8 men down, some wounded lightly, some badly, all of them combat ineffective in under 30 seconds. The tactical math is immediate and brutal. 8 mortarmen wounded, 75 Japanese infantry advancing through darkness. No radio contact with battalion. No way to call artillery support. No reinforcements available because every unit on the line is under simultaneous attack. This is it. This is the crisis moment where doctrine ends and survival begins. Anderson makes the call. He orders his wounded crew to fall back to an Okinawan tomb 20 meters behind their position, those ancient stone structures the locals built as family graves. Now serving as impromptu bunkers, he tells them to take cover, set up defensive positions, hold that tomb, and then he turns back to face the attack alone. 1 M1 carbine, maybe 90 rounds of ammunition total if he's lucky, facing 75 attackers who are now close enough to hear, close enough that Anderson can pick out individual sounds, boots on volcanic rock, whispered commands in Japanese, the metallic click of bayonets being fixed to Arisaka rifles. They're not 300 meters away where mortars are useful. They're not even 50 meters away where you can call indirect fire. They're 5 to 20 meters out, close assault range, and closing fast. Anderson empties his first magazine, 30 rounds in controlled bursts. He sees shapes fall in the darkness, maybe 3 Japanese down, maybe 4, but they keep coming. He reloads, fires again, more shapes drop. But the math isn't changing. 75 minus 8 still leaves 67 attackers, and he's got maybe 2 magazines left. Here's where the nightmare compounds. It's not just the numbers, it's the conditions. Pitch darkness means he's firing at sounds and shadows. He can't confirm kills, can't see how many are flanking his position, can't tell if they're 5 meters away or 50. The cold cuts through his uniform. His hands are shaking partly from adrenaline, partly from the damp chill of Okinawa in April. His wounds are bleeding steadily, not fatal yet, but enough to weaken him over time. And around him, useless, sit crates of 60mm mortar ammunition, hundreds of rounds that represent more explosive power than every grenade and rifle round in the entire sector combined. But they might as well be rocks, because mortar rounds don't work at close range. The minimum elevation angle won't allow it. If he tried to fire a mortar at targets 20 meters away, the round would fly horizontal and explode at his own feet. The physics of high-angle fire make it impossible. This is the villain, not human, not Japanese, not even the darkness. The villain is the design limitation built into every mortar system, the fact that weapons meant for indirect fire become paperweights in direct combat. Anderson has the firepower to stop this attack sitting right next to him, and he can't use any of it because Newton's laws and army doctrine say it won't work. He fires his last magazine, drops it, looks for another, finds none, carbines empty, enemy still advancing. His wounded men are 40 meters behind him in that tomb waiting to die. And Anderson has maybe 30 seconds before the Japanese overrun his position and then move on to slaughter the rest of his crew. Every option is a dead end. He could run to the tomb, but that just delays the inevitable. 75 attackers will surround the structure and reduce it with grenades and satchel charges. Everyone dies, but it takes 20 minutes instead of 5. He could charge the enemy position with his rifle empty, hoping to buy time, but that's pure suicide. He'd last 10 seconds and accomplish nothing. He could try to set up a mortar tube properly, but there's no time, no crew to operate it, and the elevation angle won't work anyway. The field manuals have no answer for this. Fort Benning didn't train for this scenario. There is no doctrine for what to do when you're a mortar specialist facing close assault with no crew, no support, and ammunition you can't use. This is the gap between theory and reality. This is where soldiers die because the situation doesn't fit the manual. But Anderson's brain is still working, still calculating, still looking for an edge. And that's when he sees it, on the ground near his position, partially buried in volcanic dirt. A Japanese mortar round that failed to detonate during the earlier bombardment. A dud, a 60mm shell lying there intact with its fuse still armed. Desperation creates clarity. Anderson picks up the enemy round, feels the weight of it, roughly 1.3 kilograms of high explosive wrapped in a steel shell, and some instinct or memory or pure desperation makes him throw it back toward the advancing Japanese. The round flies maybe 20 meters, impacts the ground, and detonates. The explosion is massive compared to a hand grenade. The fragmentation radius of a 60mm mortar is 25 meters, 5 times larger than a standard grenade. Anderson sees shapes fall, hears screaming, sees the Japanese advance stagger, and his brain makes the connection that will save his life. If an enemy mortar can detonate on impact after being thrown, then the fuse mechanism doesn't require the mortar tube. It doesn't need the propellant charge. It doesn't need careful elevation and deflection calculations. It just needs impact. Hard enough impact to trigger the fuse, and Anderson has crates of American 60mm rounds sitting right next to him. He moves to the ammunition, pulls out a round, studies it for maybe 5 seconds in the darkness, his mind racing through everything he knows about mortar fuse mechanisms. The safety pin that keeps the fuse from arming during transport. The setback mechanism that arms the fuse when the round accelerates out of the tube. The impact detonator that fires when the round hits the target. The insight hits him. Setback is just acceleration. Violent backward force that moves internal components and aligns the fuse. If he can simulate that force without the tube, if he can create enough impact to move those internal parts. He looks around, sees a large volcanic rock near his fighting position, and makes a decision that violates every safety protocol in the Army manual. Anderson pulls the safety pin from the fuse. He's now holding a live round with only the mechanical lock preventing detonation. He inverts the shell so the base is pointing down, and he smashes it against the rock with maximum force. Inside the round, he hears a faint click, metal moving against metal, the setback mechanism engaging, the fuse arming itself without benefit of propellant or tube, pure kinetic force from impact substituting for explosive acceleration. He doesn't hesitate, doesn't test it, doesn't double check. There's no time for that. He just throws the round toward the advancing Japanese. A desperate heave that sends the shell tumbling through the darkness for maybe 20 meters before it impacts the volcanic ground and detonates. The explosion lights up the night. Fragmentation sprays across a 25-meter radius. Anderson hears screams, sees bodies fall, watches the Japanese advance falter. It works, the physics works, the fuse doesn't care how it gets armed, it only cares about the mechanical sequence. Impact creates setback. Setback moves the internal ring. The ring aligns the detonator with the striker. Impact triggers the striker. Striker hits the detonator. Detonator initiates the explosive train, and 1.3 kilograms of Composition B turns into expanding gas and supersonic metal fragments. Anderson doesn't celebrate, doesn't stop to appreciate the engineering. He just moves, reaches for another round, pulls the pin, smashes the base against the rock, hears that critical click, throws it 20 meters, impact, detonation, more screams. He's creating a killing zone without benefit of crew or tubes or calculated fire missions. He's turned himself into a one-man artillery battery using nothing but improvisation and mechanical understanding. The rhythm develops, smash, throw, detonate, smash, throw, detonate. He alternates between mortar rounds and his carbine, which he's somehow found more ammunition for, fires a burst to keep the Japanese disoriented, throws another round. The enemy can't figure out what's happening. They expected rifle fire and grenades. Instead, they're taking mortar fire from impossible angles at impossible ranges. Their own tactical doctrine has no answer for this. 14 rounds total over approximately 25 minutes, each one armed by hand, each one thrown, each one detonating on impact. The mathematics of warfare shift from 75 versus 1 to 75 versus sustained explosive bombardment. The Japanese advance breaks. They're taking casualties faster than they can replace them. Their machine gun crews get hit by fragmentation. Their knee mortar teams get suppressed. The organized assault deteriorates into chaos. Anderson is bleeding from multiple wounds, shrapnel from the initial bombardment, and probably from his own mortar rounds detonating close enough to send fragments back toward his position. But he keeps moving, keeps throwing, because stopping means dying, and dying means his 8 wounded men in that tomb die too. So he works through the pain, through the cold, through the exhaustion, smash, throw, detonate, over and over until the ammunition runs out or the enemy breaks. The Japanese pull back. Not routed, but definitely disrupted. They leave behind 25 dead according to the official count. Multiple destroyed machine guns. Several wrecked knee mortars. The wounded and the survivors retreat into the darkness. And Anderson, still bleeding, still functional, makes a decision that separates good soldiers from great ones. He could seek medical attention. He's earned it. He's wounded badly enough that evacuation would be justified. But instead, he walks through the darkness, navigating by memory and instinct until he finds his company commander. And when he reports it's not about his own actions, it's about the tactical intelligence. He tells the commander the route the Japanese used to attack, the direction they retreated, the likely assembly area they're falling back to. That intelligence gets passed to the artillery. The coordinates get calculated. And when the Japanese survivors think they've escaped, when they're moving in column formation back toward their own lines, American 105mm and 155mm shells start falling. The survivors of Anderson's mortar bombardment get caught in the open by battalion-level artillery fire. Very few make it back. April 13th dawn, Kakazu Ridge. The sun comes up on a battlefield littered with evidence. 25 Japanese dead in and around Anderson's position, destroyed equipment, blood trails leading back toward Japanese lines, and 1 American technical sergeant still standing, still bleeding, still refusing evacuation until his wounded crew gets medical attention first. The official count is verified. 25 enemy killed in action, multiple weapons destroyed, defensive sector held. Company A maintains its position. The 381st Regiment's western flank remains intact. The Japanese counteroffensive in this sector fails to achieve penetration. General Ushijima's after-action reports acknowledge that the April 12th through 13th offensive encountered stronger resistance than anticipated. Especially in the western sector, his staff notes that American defensive positions proved more resilient than intelligence suggested, that infiltration attacks achieved only limited success before being thrown back with heavy casualties. The 96th Division holds Kakazu Ridge, exhausted, bloodied, but unbroken, and 3 months later, when Okinawa finally falls, when the 32nd Army collapses and Ushijima commits ritual suicide, rather than surrender, historians will trace the turning point back to mid-April, to the failed counteroffensive that cost the Japanese their last chance at disrupting the American advance. 1 man, 1 night, 1 improvised technique. Anderson's action didn't win the Battle of Okinawa, but it held 1 critical point at 1 critical moment, and warfare is built on such moments, individual soldiers making decisions that ripple upward into strategic consequences. The Army tries to classify the technique, tries to limit discussion of percussive arming because it's dangerous, because it violates safety protocols, because if every soldier starts smashing mortar rounds against rocks, the casualty rate from premature detonations would be unacceptable. But the story spreads anyway. Veterans talk, training officers incorporate it into improvised tactics courses. By the Korean War, it's mentioned in classified briefings. By Vietnam, it's taught at Fort Benning as an example of desperate measures in extremis. Hollywood notices. Steven Spielberg's researchers find the story while preparing Saving Private Ryan. The 1998 film includes a scene where American soldiers smash mortar rounds against stones and throw them at German armor. It's a direct lift from Anderson's action, though the film never credits him by name. Millions of moviegoers watch it thinking it's dramatic license, never knowing they're seeing actual history. West Point teaches it. The Soviet Frunze Military Academy teaches it. After the Cold War ends and military exchanges become common, Russian and American officers compare notes and discover they're both teaching the same case study. Technical Sergeant Buford Theodore Anderson, Kakazu Ridge, April 13, 1945, improvised mortar bombardment under extreme duress. President Harry Truman presents the Medal of Honor personally on Memorial Day 1946. The citation reads in part extraordinary heroism in action against the enemy. It describes the defense, the casualties inflicted, the sector held, but it can't capture the physics, can't explain the mechanical understanding that made it possible. Those details exist in classified after-action reports that won't be fully declassified for decades. Anderson returns to Wisconsin, tries civilian life, briefly runs a floor sanding business in Beloit, works as an Army recruiter, eventually rejoins the Army Reserve and earns a commission as second lieutenant, serves until September 30th, 1952, 10 years total military service, then finally transitions to full civilian life. He marries Phyllis Jane Bouchard. They build a life together spanning 50 years. He doesn't talk much about Kakazu Ridge, doesn't parade his Medal of Honor, just lives quietly, serves his community, becomes the kind of humble veteran that small-town Wisconsin produces. The kind of man who did something extraordinary once and then spent the rest of his life being ordinary. November 7th, 1996, Buford Theodore Anderson dies at age 74, and 46 days later Phyllis follows him. After half a century together, she survives him by less than 2 months. They're buried together at Arlington National Cemetery. White marble headstones in perfect rows. The Medal of Honor noted on his stone, surrounded by others who served. The legacy is triple, tactical, strategic, human. Tactically, he proved that improvisation under pressure can overcome numerical superiority when combined with technical knowledge. Strategically, he held a critical defensive position during a coordinated enemy offensive, preventing penetration and possible sector collapse. Humanly, he demonstrated that courage without competence is wasted, but competence without courage is never tested, and the combination of both can change history. 75 attackers, 1 defender, 14 improvised mortar rounds, 25 enemy dead, 1 sector held, 1 battle influenced, 1 technique that rewrote the tactical manual. The numbers tell the story, but they can't capture the moment, can't recreate the darkness and cold and fear, can't explain what goes through a man's mind when he's bleeding and outnumbered, and the only way forward is through physics and desperation. April 13th, 1945, 0300 hours, Kakazu Ridge, Okinawa. Technical Sergeant Buford Theodore Anderson smashes a mortar round against volcanic rock, throws it into darkness, watches it detonate, and in that moment proves that sometimes the distance between defeat and victory is just one man who refuses to accept that the rules can't be broken.